Hi everyone, we'll just give it another minute before we start, just in case we've got some more joiners. Hi everybody, welcome to this webinar. It's just gone 1:15, so I think we'll make a start. I can see there's more people joining us. So welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. This webinar is our chance to share key emerging learnings with you from the first stage of the evaluation of Dormant Assets Northern Ireland, which we are conducting at SQW on behalf of the National Lottery Community Fund Northern Ireland. So I'll do some introductions. I'm Lauren Roberts, I'm from SQW and I'm the Evaluation Director. I'm joined today by my colleagues Jane, if you want to give a wave, Jane, and Luke, give a wave. And we're also got on the call representatives from the National Lottery Community Fund Northern Ireland. We've got Jenny Fitzgerald, who is the funding manager. Hi Jenny, and Jenny will be monitoring and moderating the Q&A session today. And we've also got Alison Fraser on from the National Lottery Community Fund. Alison is the Senior Head of Funding, and we'll hear from her in a second. So hopefully you can all see the slides. I'm going to run you through some basic housekeeping before we get started. So this session is scheduled to run for 45 minutes. You will probably notice that your microphones, your webcams, your ability to share and the chat function are all disabled. And this is basically so that we ensure we stick to time. The webinar will be running for 45 minutes and we've got an awful lot to cover in that period. If you want to contribute, and we really do want your comments, your reflections, your questions, please do so using the Q&A function. The chat function is disabled, so please only use that and please try not to raise your hand instead. Just use the Q&A function. And I should let you all know this webinar is being recorded and it will be published on the National Lottery Community Fund's website, and you'll all get a copy after today's session. So I will now hand you over to Alison, who's the Senior Head of Funding. She's going to say a few words.
Afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Lauren, and thank you for inviting me to introduce today's webinar. Lauren and Jane are going to cover the context and background to the development of dormant funding in Northern Ireland, as well as the findings from the interim evaluation of Phase 1 grant programme. But I just wanted to give you a bit of my personal reflections before we delve into the detail. I know many of you will already be familiar with the Dormant Assets Scheme, but for those who aren't, dormant funds are neither national lottery funding or exchequer money, but funds released by financial institutions from bank and building society accounts and other financial products, which have been dormant for more than 15 years. Dormant Bank and Building Society Accounts Act in 2008 legislated for this money to be used for good causes, and the National Lottery Community Fund is named as the distributor of this funding across the United Kingdom. In Northern Ireland, our annual income from dormant accounts funding is between £2 and £3 million. So by the time we received the policy directions in Northern Ireland in 2019, expectations were high and a significant amount of funding had accrued. And this gave us an opportunity to front load a big investment of approximately 20 million for the first phase grant programme as an acknowledgement of the significant need within the sector as it recovered from the impact of COVID, austerity and the cost of living crisis. The response to the grant programme demonstrated the scale of need for this type of funding that builds on the strengths of the VCSE sector organisations to deliver the valuable work in a sustainable way. We always said that we would take a test and learn approach to developing successive phases of the dormant accounts programme and share learning, what works and what doesn't. It's an important contribution in itself, understanding what doesn't work as we develop a stronger sector. Since launching the programme in 2021, we've hosted a number of networking sessions for grant holders to share experiences and learn from each other. We also felt it was important to get a robust, independent evaluation of the delivery and impact of the grant programme in order to inform future funding options and also to provide a useful resource for the sector on what works and doesn't work to improve the capacity, sustainability and resilience of the sector. Our evaluators, SQW, published their first interim evaluation report last month, and you should have received a link to this report from our team. And it's brilliant to have the opportunity today to hear from them and share some of their findings with us. So I hope you enjoy today's session, and I'll now pass over to Lauren and Jane to share some further details with you.
Thanks so much, Alison. So today's session is to present those emerging findings from the first phase of our evaluation of Dormant Assets Phase 1 grant programme. So in terms of what we'll be covering, my colleague Jane will be talking you through learning from the wider evidence base. We've reviewed that. We've also looked at to what extent the effective practice that we identified in the wider evidence base is being replicated as part of this programme amongst grant recipients. So we'll talk you through that. We'll talk you through some of the enablers and challenges experienced by grant recipients. We'll talk you through some of the key emerging outcomes and also the expected longer term impacts and how those compare with those that didn't receive funding but did apply to the fund. And we'll also then pause at the end for questions and any comments that you might have. So I'll give you a bit of background and context before we get into the specifics around the evaluation. So a dormant asset is a financial product which has been dormant for at least 15 years, where an owner can't be identified and contacted. So there was legislation passed in 2008 that established a system for distributing funding from dormant bank accounts and building society accounts to good causes in the UK. And in 2022, further legislation was passed that expanded this to financial assets. So things like insurance products or pensions. So the policy direction in Northern Ireland comes from the Department of Finance, Northern Ireland, and the National Lottery Community Fund is the named distributor of the funds across the entire UK. So in September 2019, the Department of Finance Northern Ireland directed the National Lottery Community Fund to establish a scheme to use those dormant account funds in Northern Ireland to focus on building the capacity, resilience and sustainability of the Northern Ireland voluntary and community sector. So a bit of detail about the grant programme. Its design and focus was influenced by extensive consultation with the voluntary and community sector in Northern Ireland to really understand the key issues that are being faced and how the funding could genuinely support those organisations with their resilience, their capacity and their sustainability. So the grant programme went live and was distributed by the National Lottery Community Fund. It launched for applications in January 2021 and accepted applications up to March 2023. And in that time, it received over 700 applications. And that led to just under £20 million of funding being awarded to 244 voluntary and community sector organisations in Northern Ireland. So I'll just talk you briefly about what we're doing on the evaluation and then we'll get into the emerging findings. So we started our work in November 2023 and we are running through to May next year. And what we're going to talk about today are the findings from the Wave 1 evaluation activities. So in terms of what we did in Wave 1, we looked at existing documentation and data, so things such as application data, assessment data, key programme documents. We carried out a series of conversations during scoping with some of the key programme staff involved in administering and managing the fund, and also some other key stakeholders. And Jane and Luke attended a learning event back in the spring, and some of you may well recognise them from that event. And we also conducted 2 online surveys, one of grant holders who'd received their grant at least 12 months prior to our fieldwork taking place, and one of unsuccessful applicants. So we got 58 responses to the grant holder survey, which is about 40% response rate, and 49 responses from unsuccessful applicants, which I think was about a 21% response rate. We then held a series of conversations with those grant holders and unsuccessful applicants who filled in the survey and agreed to speak with us. And we carried out a rapid review of the wider evidence base, which involved us looking at, I think it was 16 documents in full to try and extract relevant learning. So as Alison said, the first interim report has been published. The link to that is on here, but we will talk you through the key headlines today. And I will now hand over to Jane, who will talk you through learning from the wider evidence base.
Thanks very much, Lauren. So as Lauren just talked about, we delivered a rapid review of wider evidence, which drew on 16 documents focused on VCSE organisations' capacity, resilience and sustainability. So the sample that we've used today is fairly small, but actually the themes across the evidence were relatively consistent in determining what is effective in building VCSE capacity, resilience and sustainability. So I'm going to talk through each one of these 6 themes in turn, but it's important to say that these themes didn't work in silo. A holistic approach is needed, as in organisations should be implementing more than one of these themes in order to build their capacity, resilience, sustainability. And the evidence also talked about how these are implemented, and these should be tailored to organisations' own needs, challenges, priorities. So it's important to say, well, these are themes of effective practice. It's definitely not one size fits all. So the first 2 themes are more strategic approaches. So the first is around the diversification of income sources. This could include securing longer term grants or contracts, but could also be considering alternative funding models such as social enterprise, crowdfunding, and social investment. Although interestingly, in the evidence, there didn't seem to be any consensus on the amount of funding that should be obtained through any one of these sources, again, which comes back to the need to tailor to an organisation's own needs. The second, to undertake regular strategic, operational and financial planning, which should be embedded in a shared ambition and engages the relevant stakeholders early, which could be staff, board members, funders. And the evidence talked about some key enablers to planning, including allocating staff time to deliver it well, implementing some sort of progress monitoring so you can track the success or effectiveness of what's actually planned, and also ensuring that organisational leadership are fully involved and brought into the process. And the evidence also touched a little bit on financial planning and talks about using specialist software to make the process more efficient, robust, and likely easier. The third and fourth theme are more people-focused. So the third is around investment in staff and volunteer recruitment and training. And the evidence talked about developing existing staff as being more effective or can be more effective than creating more posts or new posts. And this could be down to things like cost effectiveness, sustainability of post funding, or just down to the wider benefits of investing in and developing your staff on things like retention and capacity building. Obviously, this does require investment. Staff need protected time in order to engage with training that they're being asked to do. And more widely, there does need to be some sort of financial security within an organisation in order to be able to invest in staff development. So the evidence, again, talks about seeking out longer term, more flexible funding rather than short term grants, linked to what I said before about income streams, which I'm very conscious is easier said than done. And then the second people-focused theme is around leadership and management, strong leadership and management capabilities who can support the effective adoption and delivery of strategies and can really set a clear vision and values for the organisation, which is valuable for both staff and funders. So there's one study in the evidence which tracked a sample of third sector organisations over, I think it was about 14 years, and unsurprisingly found that none of those deemed well managed had closed when faced with times of particular adversity, but a number of those that were deemed less well managed had, and this was attributed to kind of lack of effective management, but also a lack of strong governance. And then the final 2 themes are around external engagement. So the 5th theme is around relationship building and partnership working on various levels. So with other VCSE organisations, with organisations from other sectors, whether that be public or private sector organisations. And the reason the evidence highlighted this is so important in building capabilities is that it builds on an organisation's support networks, which can be drawn on in difficult times. And one of the studies we looked at found that less isolated VCSE organisations were more resilient in times of crisis because they could rely on partnerships to share workload or resources or kind of other issues and shared challenges. And then the final theme is focused on VCSE organisations demonstrating or quantifying their impact and social value. And this was primarily to attract funders, donors, or supporters. And to demonstrate impact and social value, there needs to be effective practices and processes in place to collect and share evidence around these things. So having effective monitoring, evaluation, and reporting processes in place. And speaking as evaluators, we definitely understand the challenges in measuring social impacts, but there are tools which can help to do this. So the evidence talked about the social value engine tool, which essentially seeks to quantify impact financially. And then there's also the new economy cost-benefit analysis tool, which we've used a few times. So those are 6 themes. And really importantly, in the context of this grant programme, is that we saw evidence of all of these themes being implemented by grant holders. As you can see on the graph on the right, how the funding was used really varied and was often delivered in combination. So different activities were delivered together and was always tailored to the specific needs and priorities of the organisation itself. So for example, there's one organisation who used the funding to both diversify their income streams and build external partnerships. So they developed an e-commerce platform, sell merchandise, and then also appointed an operations and commercial manager to support them in developing partnerships. Another used the funding to deliver training to organisations' leadership team to build capabilities, and also commissioned advice and guidance around kind of strategic planning around improving their systems and infrastructure. They're really varied, but really tailored. An important point, just to finish on this section, is that all grant holders we heard from were making progress in delivering these activities. Clearly, it's not straightforward to just go about implementing these activities. There are significant challenges facing VCSE organisations, but there were also factors which grant holders identified as enabling factors and certainly enabled them to deliver effective practice. So I'll start with some of the enablers. I guess the obvious one is the grant funding itself is a considerable enabler, but not just because it was more money to invest in delivery of these activities, but because the fund was designed to allow that tailored approach. And this enabled grant holders to take organisational risks that were appropriate for their own needs and priorities. And the grant programme itself also provided wraparound support, as Alison alluded to before, the opportunities for networking, and this was said to be really valuable for grant holders in developing their learning and opportunities for networking. And there were also organisational mechanisms which enabled the delivery of grant-funded activities, and this included leadership and management buy-in to the delivery of kind of these new ways of working, having appropriate strategies or action plans in place to deliver new activities, and also effective community and stakeholder engagement. And grant holders also commented on specific delivery mechanisms that they had implemented to make the delivery of funded activities go a little bit more smoothly. So this included doing some research and scoping to inform their application or even before they received any funding. So for example, looking at customer demands and income opportunities or scoping out potential partners so they could start delivery of activities more quickly. Grant holders also talked about being flexible in delivery, adapting their plans to respond to emerging learning or challenges, and bringing in the required skills to support delivery of activities as well. So whether that be through appointing staff with specialist skills to deliver activities associated with capacity, resilience and sustainability, or maybe commissioning specialists to provide training, advice or support. Alongside this, grant holders really sought to increase their own internal capacity to deliver activities, which was seen as a real enabler and also an outcome. And this varied in terms of examples. So it could have been through delivering training for existing staff, or it could be freeing up time for senior staff to deliver strategic planning activities. Also, grant holders talked about involving existing staff or partners in delivering activities associated with building capacity, resilience and sustainability. And this was seen as a really important enabler as it supported buy-in and that sense of ownership. So there was an example from one grant holder who involved their whole team in supporting an organisational rebrand. So the whole team worked with a copywriter and a web designer, and that gave ownership of the branding to the whole team, but it also meant that the organisation's ethos and culture was properly captured in that rebrand. So there's dual benefits to that. As I said, there were some significant challenges in delivering grant-funded activities and achieving outcomes as a result. And these came from two angles, so external issues and internal challenges. External factors were discussed by both the grant holders that we spoke with, as well as unsuccessful applicants more generally, in terms of why they struggled to implement activities that they'd intended to if they'd had the funding. I don't think any of these will be surprising. So the lack of grant funding available, and alongside this was the short-termism of grant funding, which meant that organisations always had to be on the lookout for more. And organisations also talked about this being exacerbated in the Northern Irish context, given there was less funding coming from traditional government sources during the collapse of the executive, although grant holders we spoke with felt that this was beginning to improve. And then compounding these issues is increasing costs more generally, including salaries and premises costs as a result of cost of living crisis. And then there were specific internal factors which affected the ability of organisations to deliver grant-funded activities and achieve their desired outcomes. And this included a lack of capacity to deliver activities. Some grant holders just said that they'd underestimated how long it was going to take or how much capacity they needed. And a small number of grant holders also said that they didn't have enough support from leadership, although this was a very small number. And then there were also some really specific barriers to delivering grant-funded activities, which were linked to the specific activities that different organisations had planned. So, for example, some grant holders were seeking to recruit specialist staff to deliver activities, but found there was just a lack of suitable applicants, or what they were offering in terms of salaries couldn't compete with other industries. And also the fact that partnership development takes time, which slowed down delivery in some cases. And then those who were seeking to deliver digital interventions to improve capacity and resilience sometimes found that the market and technologies were changing too quickly for them to remain competitive. All of these factors meant that many grant holders felt that following dormant assets, they might still need a bit more funding. And while the grant funding had given them the tools to be sustainable in the long term, sometimes funding was still needed to be able to continue operating in the short term. That said, despite these challenges, grant holders were delivering activities which was building their capacity, resilience, sustainability, as I said, giving them the tools to do that. And I'm going to pass over to Laura now to talk you through what they've achieved as a result.
So much, Jane. So I'll talk to you about some of the key emerging outcomes evidence and talk to you about expected impacts. Now, there is a caveat over this. This is all self-reported by grant holders, and also when we're looking at comparator data, it's self-reported by those organisations that did not receive funding but did apply for it. We've not been able to independently verify what we've heard, but the messages we think are really encouraging. So there is evidence of early outcomes emerging. These centred mainly around 4 key themes, although there is a longer list provided in the report if you do want to take a look. Now, the most commonly reported area of outcomes was around new ways of working to enhance operations, and this was reported in the survey by 74% of grant holder respondents. And this included a whole range of different ways of working. So, for example, offering new services, or engaging with a partner in order to expand their work with service users. There were also examples of where grant holders had engaged service users in strategic decision making, for example, involving them on their organisation's board of directors. And what's really interesting about this outcome area is that these changes in new ways of working were reported to have led to increased income for organisations. So it's a really important outcome area. Next most commonly reported was the development of staff confidence, skills and knowledge, and this was reported by 72% of grant holder survey respondents. And this is interesting because it spanned several key aspects. So one key aspect was around improved staff mindsets and confidence. So we heard from one grant holder, for example, that they'd benefited from a changed mindset internally. They'd employed a new post holder who'd really encouraged creativity amongst the team, and that was reported to have made a difference. Another key aspect under this theme was improved practical knowledge to support their new ways of working. So, for example, developing knowledge around aspects such as intellectual property rights, or in specialist areas related to their organisation's areas of focus and ways of working, such as, for one organisation, play therapy. We heard about staff developing improved delivery skills, and we also heard about improved staff morale leading to greater confidence. So one organisation recruited an operations manager who implemented a new system of staff reward and recognition alongside a team huddle system. So they were improving engagement, improving communication, and that was all said to have improved morale and confidence. Something really interesting about the findings around improved staff confidence, skills and knowledge is that a lot of these actually weren't directly developed. A lot of these took place indirectly, so via activities that were not directly focused on this. This was almost a sort of byproduct outcome that was reported. The next most commonly reported outcome area related to implementing fit-for-purpose systems and processes. So examples reported here included increased digitisation, digital transformation, for example, consolidating websites, enhanced marketing campaigns, improved social media presence, developing new policies and processes. And finally, grant holders also reported a ripple effect of outcomes for their partners, particularly others in the voluntary and community sector. We think this is really interesting because it does indicate that actually receiving the grant funding can have wider effects. And the ways in which these were achieved were through, for example, employing local community organisations to support their work, or acting as a conduit for new partnerships and relationships between different organisations. So about 30% of grant holder survey respondents said that some of the outcomes they achieved were not expected originally, but sometimes this was about them not expecting to achieve these outcomes at the same rate of pace or at the same scale as they actually did. And generally speaking, grant holders did attribute the outcomes reported to the grant funding. About 69% said they wouldn't have achieved the outcomes without the grant. And when we looked at the feedback from unsuccessful applicants, they had largely hoped to achieve similar outcomes to those achieved by the grant holders. However, about half, just under half, of unsuccessful applicant survey respondents said that they'd not been able to achieve any of the outcomes anticipated. And amongst those that said they had achieved outcomes, generally they took longer to achieve, they're reported to be of lower quality or are of smaller scale. So no unsuccessful applicant survey respondents said they'd been able to achieve all of the outcomes sought in their entirety at the same quality and pace. So that really does indicate that the grant funding has genuinely made a difference to those organisations that received it. We also explored anticipated impacts longer term. We were doing this field work, in some cases only a year after organisations received their funding. So we wanted to explore what was anticipated longer term. And there were three key areas that were highlighted. The first was around improved financial resilience, which was highlighted by survey respondents and interviewees. And this was credited as being due to the grant funding really aiding the organisations to secure a more sustainable income, to leverage new opportunities and diversify their income streams. Organisations talked about having increased capacity to think about longer term issues, to think more strategically. And some organisations talked about increased visibility and credibility. And sometimes this was due to the new areas of work they were taking forward. Sometimes it was about that social media presence. But really important to this were the new partnerships that organisations had formed, and in particular corporate partnerships. So this is all emerging evidence, but it does indicate that the grant funding has genuinely increased capacity and sustainability and is leading to voluntary and community sector organisations becoming more resilient and prepared for the future. So it is really encouraging at the end of wave one. So I will briefly talk you through our next steps with the evaluation, and then we will pause and take questions and comments. So as I said, these are the findings from wave 1. We are currently in wave 2, and this will be followed by a third wave of data collection. So in wave 2, we currently have the surveys live with the next tranche of grant holders and unsuccessful applicants. So if you have received the survey and have not yet completed it, please do fill it in. Genuinely, we are really interested in what you've got to say, and your views are really important to the evaluation. We will then be having a series of conversations with some of those survey respondents, so with grant holders and unsuccessful applicants. And we will be taking forward some case studies, so really trying to understand in more detail some of those outcomes and impacts emerging, and some of that contextualised learning at an organisational level. And we will be producing our second interim report and sharing the findings early next year. So I will pause there and hand over to Jenny for any questions and comments.
Thanks very much, Lauren and Jane. Really interesting overview of the findings so far. So yes, just as a time for all of you guys who are on the webinar to just chip in with any questions you might have or comments and reflections on what you've heard this afternoon. So far, we don't have any questions or comments. I'll just start things off with some of the things that maybe occurred to me while you were going through all of the findings. I suppose one of the things, was there anything that particularly surprised you about the emerging findings?
Shall I start with that, Jane, and feel free to jump in? I think for me, there were two key things that perhaps surprised me. One was the extent to which the grant funding is genuinely making a difference for organisations already. So when we asked about outcomes achieved and compared that to unsuccessful applicant organisations, there was a stark difference in terms of the extent to which organisations were reporting they were achieving the outcomes they'd expected to or wanted to. So that's one thing. The other thing is around the reflections on the fund processes. So this wasn't a primary area of exploration for us, but we genuinely heard that actually the focus on longer term planning, sustainability, rather than short term funding for, I guess, operational activities, it genuinely was seen to add value, was really praised, and the way the fund operated in terms of that kind of flexibility and leaving it up to organisations to determine actually what help they really needed. I think that really stood out for us. But Jane, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's one specific point around collaboration, which we didn't really elaborate on. But a lot of the grant holders kind of said that they would initially planned to undertake collaborative activities, and lots of them did. There were lots of really good examples, but one area where it was quite challenging was collaboration with other VCSE sector organisations. And grant holders who kind of talked about this in more detail put this down to the challenges in accessing some of the funding has meant that organisations in the sector are increasingly seeing each other as competition and maybe don't want to share learning, which is, you know, complete contrast to what the evidence says, and what we're hearing is that actually collaboration is really important for improving resilience. So I thought that was quite an interesting juxtaposition.
That really is interesting, actually. Jane, maybe some of the attendees might have some comments on that. I mean, what they find difficult about collaboration. There's a few questions popped up now. So one of the first question that came up was, can a current or former grant recipient volunteer to be a case study?
Jane, do you want to take that one about case studies?
Yeah, so as Lauren said, we are working in waves. So we are speaking to, we're doing case studies with those who, at the time we did the field work, will have had more than a year's worth of delivery behind them. There's absolutely no reason why you can't volunteer your time. We would love to hear from you in terms of what you've done and what you've learned. In terms of the case studies, we are selecting those that have been able to kind of demonstrate particular impact, so they're more showcase case studies. But if you would like to volunteer to participate in any sort of evaluation activity, we would love to hear from you, and please do. And my email is, I'm sure, somewhere, and yeah, I will pop that somewhere so you can, there we go. My email's there. So if you'd like to contact me, yeah, we would very much welcome your time. So thank you very much.
That's great, thanks. And just another question about the process, about who should have received the survey for Wave 2. This grant holder received an award in September 2023, so just sort of last September.
So if you received your award in September 2023, you will be in Wave 3. So you won't have received anything yet, so don't worry. Right. You'll receive something in the spring, and please do respond. That would be really helpful.
And this question here, has there been much insight into the next steps for organisations? You know, how many will be able to continue their work after the grant has ended?
That is a really good question, a really interesting question, and something that we will be looking to explore as we go on. I'm sorry, I can't give you a more definitive answer than that. So obviously this is an interim report with emerging findings. So hopefully by the time we get to the end of the evaluation, which will be in May next year, we'll be able to give you a bit more of a concrete answer on what we know about that. But it's something that's really important. It's something, you know, in the back of our minds when we're conducting this evaluation. So it will be definitely interesting to see what emerges around that.
Yeah. There aren't any other questions on the Q&A at the minute, but I was wondering whether or not there was any specific findings that were particularly relevant for the Northern Ireland context.
Yes, I think we've been mindful of that throughout. We are aware that, you know, it's got to be context specific. So I think there is a context for the voluntary and community sector in Northern Ireland with, you know, short-term funding for the sector, increasing cost of living challenges. And we know that those issues have been exacerbated by the uncertain funding landscape as a result of both the COVID-19 pandemic, but also, you know, the collapse of the Northern Ireland Executive, alongside, not specific to Northern Ireland, the increasingly strained public sector funding environment, the UK's exit from the EU. So there are findings that I think are sort of, or there are contextual factors that I think are unique to Northern Ireland that do make a difference, have made a difference in terms of motivations for application, but also I think in terms of what the funded organisations have sought to do. But there are contextual factors that will continue to make a difference going forward, that some of which are specific to Northern Ireland and some of which are applicable elsewhere in the UK.
Interesting, thank you. Another thing, Jane, you mentioned that one of the things that organisations found most challenging was collaborating with other voluntary and community organisations. Were there any examples where organisations had managed to do this successfully?
So there are examples of where organisations, VCSE organisations, grant holders had been able to kind of collaborate with other organisations and work in partnership. I think it was less so between VCSE organisations. From what we found out, that's not to say it didn't happen. It's just to say we didn't hear about it. But there are some really nice examples of grant holders working with other partners. So there's a really nice example in the report where a grant holder had used part of their grant to kind of work with a new partner on a new work stream. And essentially they were kind of offering this as some added value for the new partner, but it did enable them to kind of prove themselves through this work stream. And as a result, the partner had agreed to continue funding the work stream, and that has opened up obviously a new income stream for them. And also because the new partner was in kind of like a different service area, it also opened up a new cohort of service users for the organisation. So it's enabled them to grow as well. So that's just a really nice example, I think, of partnership working really making a difference, and yeah, has been done through the grant funding.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I think that's all of our questions, and time's nearly up. So thanks very much for the people who posted up questions. Really appreciate it. And I'll hand back to you to wind up.
Thank you, Jenny. There's not much more for us to say apart from thank you so much to everybody who's taken part in the evaluation so far. We couldn't have done this without you. So thank you for your time. And if you are invited to participate going forward, please do take the time. We know your time's really important, but this is genuinely making a difference. So we will close there. You will get a copy of the webinar recording, and please do provide us with any feedback or comments after today's session. So I will close and say thank you, everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.